Welcome to mindyourhealthcast.com. Our weekly, hopefully informative broadcast to bring you any and all things related to health. And each week we take sometimes a specific subject, sometimes a drawing together of subjects or whatever. And this is one that has been kind of weighing on my mind real heavily. I know we have brought pieces of this along the way and they were interspersed with other subjects. However, today we're going to kind of focus on something that I call illness, a national preoccupation. Now, it's interesting to me as I listen to and observe people, not only that come in to see me as a patient, but every place you go, whether it's a restaurant or a mall or any kind of store, all these people are discussing, well, my doctor said, or my doctor told me that I should, blah, blah, blah. And it seems that everybody's all lined up to get their latest fix from the medical establishment, always in the hope that somewhere there's that magic cure, especially overnight. And it's funny because I have people come in and I say, well, how long have you been being treated by this? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And you're not well? Well, no. Well, why do you keep going back? Well, I don't know. I guess I didn't know what else to do. So we see it over and over and over, and when you look around, you see all these new hospitals going up or expanding. You see all these urgent care centers opening up all over. You see more and more clinics opening. You see more and more cancer centers opening. You see more and more medical specialty groups opening. And so it's just an ever-expanding market, and yet when we look at, and again I say the results are the criteria to determine if something is working. And I keep asking the question, are we healthier now than before? And the answer, of course, is pretty obvious. Unless someone has been blind, the answer is no. We aren't healthier. We have more chronic illnesses than ever. We have more cancer than ever. The predictions are that it's going to get worse. So somewhere, somehow, with all of this trillions of dollars that are being spent for medical care, and we always call it the health bill, but it's really the sick bill, people aren't better. And so I began thinking about it and wondering just, how bad is it? And there have been some people who have done some digging, and one in particular was done some time back, actually. In fact, it was written back in 2003, and it was authored by 3 MDs and 2 PhDs. And it's called Death by Medicine. Now, I'm sure it was never posted on the evening news or never hit the headlines in the paper because it's an indictment, and the indictment is based on material that was not, what do I want to say, it was not just somebody's hypothesis. These were all figures taken from various recognized sources and brought together, which of course I'm sure that the powers that be in the medical establishment would not be real happy if this is out in the public purview, but nonetheless it's there and it's not like it's dreamed up. And so I thought I would just kind of overview it a little bit. And here's what they say to begin with: a definitive review and close reading of medical peer-reviewed journals, which would be things like the Journal for the American Medical Association, which is commonly referred to as JAMA, and the New England Journal of Medicine, governmental statistics, etc., etc. And so it's said that the conclusion was American medicine frequently causes more harm than good. Now, it's more than frequently. The number of people having in-hospital adverse drug reactions to prescribed medicine, 2.2 million. And then they go on and talk about it, but they put it out in the form of tables and breaks it down to the different types of reactions. Now we're talking on an annual basis. Now we're talking back a few years already. So at the increase that's occurring within the field of medicine and drugs, we know that the numbers as far as cost is much higher. But at any rate, here these are all annual, and it's called the annual physical and economic costs of medical intervention. Okay, in hospitals, adverse drug reactions, 106,000 deaths at a cost of $12 billion. Now, in this article, and you can look it up yourself, you can go on the internet and search it out, these are all cited from people in the medical field or in governmental agencies that verify this. Medical errors, 98,000 at a cost of $2 billion. Bed sores, 115,000 at a cost of $55 billion. You know, those bed sores, at least in terms of regular medicine, don't heal up very well. There is a way to do it very naturally and very inexpensively, but they're not going to be able to do it. And of course, it's because of not turning people and moving them around, and because those are generated by pressure on the same spot. And $55 billion in treatments for that. Infections, 88. Now this again would be from the hospital, 88,000 at a cost of $5 billion. Malnutrition, 108,800. The hospital diet is anything but nutritious, and I know that people have actually died by dehydration while being in a hospital. You know, the attendants come around and they put this pitcher of water in the room, and they come back later and switch it and put a new one in, and nobody is checking to see whether the people actually are drinking the water. And especially in the elderly, there's a tremendous amount of people that expire just because of dehydration. But the malnutrition is also terrible. The worthless food that's being served, missing nutrients, canned, dehydrated, whatever the sources of it are, it's probably, in my mind, bottom of the barrel. In fact, a friend of mine said one time, I know finally what they do with the leftover airplane food. They give it to the hospitals. Anyhow, outpatient adverse drug reactions, 199,000 at $77 billion cost. Unnecessary procedures, 37,136 at a cost of $122 billion. Surgery-related deaths, 32,000 at a cost of $9 billion. And ADR medical errors, 420,000 deaths at a cost of $200 billion. So bottom line, for, again, these are annual, this isn't over a long period of time, 999,936, almost a million deaths. Annual unnecessary medical events statistics. Okay, so unnecessary events are hospitalization and procedures, is how it's broken down. Under hospitalization, 8.9 million. Procedures, 7.5 million, for a total of 16.4 million. Iatrogenic events, now those are events caused by the treatment, 1.78 million, and under the procedures, 1.3 million, for a total of 3 million. So here we're talking about a lot of problems. Now, someone did some checking and they said all the statistics above represent a 1-year span. Imagine the numbers over a 10-year period. Working with the more conservative figures from our statistics, we project the following 10-year death rates, and then they go on to do some projections. And I'm not going to read all the individual things, but the final is 7,841,360, and those deaths over 10 years caused by iatrogenic, meaning by the treatment, and nosocomial is the other term that's used, which means by the being in the hospital, is more than all the casualties from wars that America has fought in its entire history. In 10 years, the medical establishment has wiped out more people than the wars that we've ever had have wiped out. And so they get into the breaking down into two things: unnecessary, again, 10 years, hospitalization 89 million, iatrogenic events 17 million, procedures 75 million, iatrogenic events 15, for a total of 164 million. These projected figures show that a total of 164 million people, approximately 56% of the population of the United States, has been treated unnecessarily by the medical industry. In other words, about 50,000 people per day. And of course, they go on to say here, as we shall show, only about 5 to 20% of iatrogenic incidents are even recorded. Now, that's the other thing. I've done a lot of checking, and I noticed that the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, estimates that adverse events, probably only about 10% ever get actually reported, either because no one wants to get in trouble, or they don't pay attention, or whatever reason, they don't get reported. And I know they were talking about at one point adverse events from immunizations, and they had a number of 45,000, and then they followed that by the statement that likely only about 10% get reported, so instead of 445,000, that would be 450,000. So the numbers are kind of hard sometimes because they're all based on whether the doctors are really going to report the events. So we see that the problem is there, and there's just so many things in the background to go with that. It's I don't want to be redundant about it, so some of it we won't even bother talking about. Now, even the FDA, if you look at their websites, you will find that they talk something about adverse drug reactions. And they talk about, and I got it right from their site. I went on to the FDA site, printed it out, and they have a section called Why Learn About Adverse Drug Reactions. And of course, this is for people in the medical field. Over 2 million serious adverse drug reactions yearly. That's again from the FDA. 100,000 deaths yearly. Again, if they're only reporting 10%, then that would be 1 million. Adverse drug reactions is the fourth leading cause of death ahead of pulmonary disease, diabetes, AIDS, pneumonia, accidents, and automobile deaths. Now, this is again FDA. Ambulatory patient adverse death rate is unknown. Ambulatory means those that are out moving around. There's no way of knowing how many of those. Now, I know that there's a lot of those because some of the drugs, there's a huge amount of deaths before the drug was ever pulled. Nursing home patients' adverse drug reaction rate 350,000 yearly. Again, from the FDA's own website. It's there. And as one guy wrote a blog, he said that it's hidden from plain view. I mean, in plain view, it's right there, but nobody pays much attention to it. And I noted that there was another study that showed over 5 years, 800,000 people died from beta blockers. And either because of over-prescribing or just the people, their body would not take it. And there's a lot of other drugs that have been on the market and are still there that are causing a lot of problems. Now, I mentioned before there's an antiarrhythmic drug that was put out several years ago, and the company that put it out knew in advance there were issues with it, but they decided they were not going to make that known. And after it was released on the market, now I've told you before, but I'll mention again, that a drug only has very limited human trials before it's finally released. So if it doesn't kill off all the pre-release human trials, they put it on the market. And then there is something called the post-release trial. Now, what that means is, it's not until the drug is out on the market and a lot of people are prescribed the drug that they begin to understand what it really does. It's too bad, but this particular antiarrhythmic, it's at least 50,000 people died suddenly taking the drug. They might be sitting, walking, or whatever, and they would just fall over dead. And guess what? It's still on the market. Never got pulled. The only thing that ever happened was there was a not a warning, but a black letter in the PDR statement that said, caution, this drug has been related to excess mortality. Now that means a lot of people died from it. So then, of course, their caveat, well, you should consider benefit versus risk. You know, they always use that term, benefit versus risk. Well, we know it's going to kill some people, but you know, some people are going to feel better with it. Now, of course, none of them cure the problem. What they do is they manage the symptoms. And some people, their body does not tolerate the management, and they're wiped out. Another one I was just looking at is a big one that's been on the market for a while now, has had a lot of bad problems leading to death, things like leukemia, tuberculosis, listeria, and so forth, and it was for actually pain relief from rheumatoid arthritis, and it's still on the market, and there's been tremendous problems from it. And see, that's not the worst of it. I've been, as I said, been following this for a long time. Now, when a drug gets its final approval, there is supposed to be something called an LD50 study. And the LD50 study means, in the laboratory animals, what is the dosage in milligrams per kilogram of body weight that will kill half the animals? That's called the LD50 study. And so the LD50 study is looked at against the effective dose. And the wider the span between those two numbers, then the safer the drug is. And so the fact is that they use that number, the LD50 number, to determine dosage for humans, even though it's based on animals. That's what they use. And the funny thing is that some reporter got wind that there was a lab whose job it was to do LD50 studies for pharmaceutical companies. In other words, they made money by taking the drug just before it's ready to be released and doing these LD50 studies and submitting that along with the other drug information that the pharmaceutical has accumulated, and is sent to the FDA for the final approval. Well, this reporter got wind that something was amiss at this lab, and so they went there to visit them in person, and when they got there, they found the lab was actually shut down. There was a bunch of animal carcasses that were rotting in the lab. Everything was dusty, and it looked like nothing had been there for a long time. And so when the FDA looked into it, they found out that they had not actually been testing drugs. They were just throwing a number out, an estimate based on who knows what, and that then that was part of the report that allowed the drug to be released. Now, of course, you would know that the FDA would be aghast, and they would say, well, gee, we put a hold on those drugs that were approved for their dosage based on LD50 studies that never happened. And guess what? Nothing happened. The drugs are all still on the market. They never bothered to pull any. You think that I'm exaggerating, and it's not true. Now, here is another one. This was an article in Scientific American. And the title of the article was, "The FDA lets drugs approved on fraudulent research stay on the market." This is the agency that is supposedly protecting the welfare of the public. And what they found out, very small print in this article, the FDA in 2011 announced years' worth of studies from a major drug research lab were potentially worthless, but it has not pulled any of the compounds from the market nor identified them. On the morning of May the 3rd, 2010, 3 agents of the Food and Drug Administration descended upon the Houston office of Satiro Research, a firm that conducted research for drug companies worldwide. Lead agent Patrick Stone, now retired from the FDA, had visited the Houston lab many times over the previous decade for routine inspections. This time was different. His team was there to investigate a former employee's allegation that the company had tampered with records and manipulated test data. When Stone explained the gravity of the inquiry to Chinna Pomidi, the testing faculty's or facility's president, the Satiro executive made a brief phone call, and moments later they brought in carts of 8 carts of double-stacked file boxes. The documents represented 5 years of data from some 1,400 drug trials. Pomidi bluntly acknowledged that much of the lab's work was fraudulent. Stone said, "You got us." Stone recalled him saying, based partly on records in the file boxes, the FDA eventually concluded that the lab's violations were so egregious and pervasive, that studies conducted there between April 2005 and August 2009 might be worthless. The health threat was potentially serious. About 100 drugs, including sophisticated chemotherapy compounds and addictive prescription painkillers, had been approved for sale in the United States, at least in part on the strength of Satiro Houston's tainted tests. The vast majority, 81, were generic versions of brand-name drugs on which Satiro scientists had often run critical tests to determine whether the copies did, in fact, act the same in the body as the originals. And it goes on. It's a lengthy article, and I'm not going to read it all. Okay, so here they find out that there's several drugs that are on the market that were based on faulty testing or fraudulent testing. So, of course, you know they're going to immediately pull the drugs, right? And, of course, the answer is no, they did not pull the drugs. And it continues like that. Now, these are only the ones that are caught. Imagine the ones that are not caught. So, next big issue, I'm just giving you some examples of what I'm talking about. Now, this FDA thing is quite, in my mind, quite serious. This is an agency that, by statute, their job is to protect the public. That's why it was established. Now, I've mentioned before a little bit about the history of the FDA, but in the late 1800s, it was already realized that there were pharmaceutical preparations that were being put on the market that were poorly labeled and, in many cases, not worthless as far as effect, but on top of it, had potential dangers. And so there was also all this food that was being put out that was processed and adulterated to the point that a chemist from the Department of Agriculture, who was also a medical doctor as well as a biochemist, realized that the food was actually unfit for human consumption. And so there were several attempts to get a law passed that would establish an agency whose job it would be to police these industries and make sure that what went out to the public was safe. Okay, so this doctor from the Department of Agriculture, Dr. Harvey W. Wiley, kind of spearheaded this. Well, there were some bills brought up, but each time a bill was brought up, there seemed to be some strong influence from pharmaceuticals and food processors that ended up the bill died and never got passed. And it was not until several events happened that got taken to President Teddy Roosevelt at the time, and he became convinced that it was a serious matter, so he went before the Congress and made the statement, you will pass a food and drug regulation law. And so they did in 1906. And the first head of that agency was Dr. Harvey W. Wiley, who was determined to get the problem in hand. Now, here's a guy who'd been around a long time. He was already at that point an elderly gentleman, but he took them to task, and he started going out and confiscating what he considered to be potentially bad food, and taking it to the lab and analyzing it. And once he analyzed it, he would issue a report stating what his finding was. Now, he would, for example, take a boxcar full of bleached white flour, which had become popular, and take it into the lab and analyze it. And his finding was that it was unfit for human consumption. In that process, then, he would confiscate the whole train car full of flour. And, of course, this made the food processors furious. And he was doing things similar in terms of drugs, saying, this is mislabeled. It's for infants and very small children. It has opium in it or some type of powerful drug. And so you have to label properly everything that's in there, and it has to be safe for the use that it's being presented for. And so the pharmaceuticals became very unhappy with them. Various of the food processors became very unhappy. And so they ignored his order, actually. And so he took them to federal court, and ultimately it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually agreed with Dr. Wiley that white flour, for example, was unfit for human consumption. But guess what? The local people ignored it anyhow, and of course it's still out there. Nothing changed. And in the meantime, the pressure started to be put on from the pharmaceuticals and the food processors. We've got to get rid of this guy. And after about just a few years, it seemed to me it was like 4 or 5 years, all of a sudden Dr. Wiley is no longer head of the FDA. By the 1930s, people were put in place that seemed to be more friendly to the food processors and the pharmaceuticals than they were to the welfare of the people that they were supposedly to be protecting. And so that is the early history, and it's continued on. And it's so interesting to me because here's drugs that they knew were not even properly tested and that are on the market, and they refused to pull them. They refused to pull the one I told you about because it didn't get a lot of press, about 50,000 people who dropped dead with the heart antiarrhythmic drug. And interestingly, 50,000 people is about the number that were killed in Vietnam over 10 years from the U.S. It was 50-some thousand people. So you would have thought, wow, what a tremendous event. That shouldn't be there. But guess what? It's still on the market. You can turn into the PDR, and it's still listed, as I said, with the bold print. Excessive mortality has been associated with this drug. but people are prescribing it. And you know, the problem is that a lot of times if people have a heart problem, for example, and they drop dead, are they going to say, oh gee, I think it was that drug? There's others like that that are very bad, that who knows? I mean, I don't know. I know there's some that are terrible. There's one that's based on a type of iodine that is also an antiarrhythmic, which is terrible in terms of what it's for. When I studied pharmacology, there were 5 levels of arrhythmias as far as the treatment, and you always were set. Now, this is what I was taught in pharmacology. You start with the lightest drug first and go through the other 4 before you would even consider the 5th, because the 5th has the potential for extremely adverse reactions and death. But you know what? A lot of the doctors don't even bother with the other 4. They go directly to number 5. And a lot of people go on it. And I had a patient who, his wife actually called from the hospital and said, we want to make an appointment. They had heard about me from someone else. Her husband had been given that drug. His body swelled to double size, and medicine says he has about a week left to live. Anyhow, she got him out of the hospital and brought him in, and we were able, fortunately, to help him recover, and he did. So he no longer had heart issues, actually, by the time it was done. But it was an antiarrhythmic drug, and it can be very nasty. So they know about that, but has it ever been pulled? No. Another drug that came out, and these are just some things that I know about. There's so many, I don't even have time to track them all down, and who knows how many are on the market. And as I say, those figures that we quoted about adverse drug reactions, who really knows how many there are and how many people die from it? Because if you're a cardiac patient and the person drops dead, the doctor is likely to sign the death certificate, cardiac arrest, MI, or what, and who's going to know? There was a man one time, a doctor actually, who spent a lot of time studying the death certificates for cause of death and looking at all the data. And he suspected that a high percentage of the people, that whatever they put on the cause of death isn't necessarily what was the real cause, and in fact, in many cases, they didn't even know. Now, I think it's interesting how the FDA reacts to protect the public. Several years ago, there was a herb by the name of chaparral, which actually is a very powerful body cleanser. Those who are in the natural health field, that would be one of the things you might consider with a real serious illness such as cancer and so forth, because it is a very powerful cleansing drug or herb. And anyhow, there was one case, now look, big number one case of an individual who had some hepatitis. Now, hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver. It can be caused by a lot of things that overload the liver, and like non-viral. It's just an inflammation going on in the liver. Okay, so they found out that this person had been taking this herb for a while, chaparral. There was no study, no testing done to determine if in fact it did cause it, because of all the hundreds of years that people have been taking chaparral, there had been no cases known of liver hepatitis or any serious problems from the herb, other than you might feel some detox symptoms, kind of draggy, tired, and some flu-like symptoms for detox, but nothing serious. But based on this one case, that there might have been a relationship, not even that it was proven, but that there might be, they immediately pulled it off. And they did something similar with tryptophan, an amino acid. And even after it was proven that there was nothing wrong with amino acid, it had been contaminated, and I have a lot of suspicions about the contamination of it. it was not the amino acid, but they refused to release it back on the market. I remember them coming around to our office and they were tracking down all the bottles of tryptophan. And the interesting thing about it, it had a couple of interesting qualities. One was that it helped people sleep, and the other was that it tended to relieve the depression if they tended to be depressed. Now, there's basically two types of insomnia. In general, one is an anxiety insomnia where the person they can't get their mind to settle down to fall asleep, so they can't fall asleep. And the second type is a depressive type of insomnia where the people fall asleep, but they wake back up and can't go back to sleep. And so tryptophan worked well with the depressive type. So anyhow, they pulled it off the market, and I thought it interesting that this one batch of tryptophan coming from Japan, where a lot of the amino acids are produced in isolated form, it was interesting to me that this all came up 2 weeks before the release of a major antidepressant by one of the pharmaceuticals. Now, I can't say for sure that that's what happened, but it just seemed, what I want to say, pretty coincidental that all this suddenly, because huge amounts of people were buying tryptophan and making use of it. It was non-toxic. It's an amino acid that your body normally needs to carry on a lot of functions anyhow. So it wasn't like it was some outside synthetic drug. And I guess here's a good point to mention, that the drugs that come on the market are synthetic molecules that are synthesized by the drug companies so they can patent them. And so many of them are made from petroleum products, coal tar products, etc. And they synthesize molecules so they can, as I say, patent them and put them on the market and have a corner on them for several years. And if it's a big hit, they make billions of dollars before other drug companies can copy it and before it goes generic. And so it's interesting to me that when you look at all this, and here again, the FDA, well, on the tryptophan, an aside that you might find interesting, there's a well-known MD in this country who was going more and more to natural medicine, and he used a lot of tryptophan with a lot of his patients. And when they pulled it off the market and it was proven that it was a contaminant, it was not a problem with the tryptophan, he petitioned the FDA to release the tryptophan, and of course they refused. And so he brought a suit against them to release it because they had no reason not to release it. And guess what happened? In a short time after he filed this lawsuit, federal marshals and local law enforcement agents converged on his office with guns drawn, held the staff at gunpoint, took all of his records, his computer hard drives, and threatened everyone. And it took him ages to get this whole thing straightened out. But now I can see how well they are out protecting the public. Now, another issue that's come up, I'm just throwing in some of the majors. And why am I doing all this? I want you to do a lot of looking and thinking on your own. Everything that I'm giving you is available. I mean, you can go on the internet and look it for yourself. And it's your choice. I mean, if you choose to take the drugs, I'm not against them, if that's what you want. I mean, this is supposedly a free country, and it's your choice for your body. And as I mentioned in another broadcast, in Texas, one of the federal courts made a ruling related to acupuncture, actually, because the people wanted it, and the medical people had blocked it being licensed so that people could have access to it, and of course the medical people didn't want to do it. And so the federal court judge ruled that people have a right to their choice in medical care, and they even have the right to make a bad choice, because that's what freedom is all about. If you want to pick something that could be adverse to you, that's your right to do that. And so in my feeling, it's the same way. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you what's available that you can learn. And if you still choose it, that's your choice, and that's fine with me. I only get the people, well, I shouldn't say only, but a high percentage of people I get are people who have exhausted the medical route first and finally are sicker than ever, and unfortunately sometimes it takes a long time to turn around the problems created by the treatments before we can really get to the cause of their problem. Now, if you keep in mind that drugs are not, by the pharmaceuticals, are not created to cure anything, they are created to manage the symptoms of. And if you read the research, you read the medical journals, you read the Lancet, the international big medical journal comes out every week, that one is always loaded with either research papers or ads from pharmaceuticals, and when you read it, the bottom line is it's for the management of the symptoms of blah blah blah. Nowhere does it say that they cure anything. Now, because you wipe out the symptoms does not mean you've cured anything. It's meaning you block the signals in the body that are creating the symptoms of whatever the person's problem is. And in most cases, that's the immune system trying to take care of some toxicity problem, and you block that, and so the people feel better. And in their mind, because you have turned that off, they feel that it's been cured and that they're well, and that's not the case. We've covered that before, way back in homotoxicology, so if you happen to go back and look at the homotoxicology broadcasts I did, you'll find out more about what I'm talking about. We don't have time to cover it today. Now, the other big thing that's been going is the cancer thing, and I just had run across an article called "Millions Wrongly Treated for Cancer, the National Cancer Institute Panel Confirms." Again, you can find that yourself. Bottom line is that they're saying that cancer is misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed when it really shouldn't be. It says, if you've been following our advocacy work on cancer, the person who presented this, particularly in connection with the Dark Side of Breast Cancer Awareness Month, you know that we have been calling for complete reclassification of some types of breast cancer as benign lesions, such as ductal carcinoma in situ, as well as pointing out repeatedly that X-ray-based breast screenings are not only highly carcinogenic. Now there's been studies of, but the doctors in this country tend to ignore it, but there have been big studies. The Lancet, the big one I told you about, said that there's no evidence that all of the mammography that's been going on has in any way improved the condition related to breast cancer, and in fact, in many cases, actually is the cause of breast cancer. There was a big study in Canada, the same thing, and those have been ignored. I guess the doctors in this country, their outward comment is, well, you know, we didn't do those studies, so we feel it's important, so we're going to continue to do mammography. But anyhow, they're saying that, this group are saying that breast screenings are not only highly carcinogenic, but also causing an epidemic of overdiagnosis and overtreatment in U.S. women, with an estimated 1.3 million cases in the past 30 years alone. This week, National Cancer Institute commissioned panel report published in the Journal of the American Medical Association outline confirmed that we all, public and professionals alike, should stop calling low-risk lesions like ductal cell carcinoma in situ and high-grade prostatic intraepithelial neoplasia as cancer. Now, again, I can think of a particular case where I had a patient who came to me without going into any details, who had a very well-recognized New York physician say that we did this screening and you have breast cancer, you should immediately come back to New York and have a mastectomy. Now, this lady was not too fond of that idea, and she somehow got referred to me, and she asked me what I thought she should do. I said, I think I would get another opinion. And so she was a very wealthy lady, and called this doctor in New York and said, I want the slide that you read from the biopsy that showed I had cancer. So she was a very big patient, and I'm sure he got some handsome fees from her because she didn't trust the doctors in Florida when she moved to Florida. And so he sent her the slide. She sent it to a pathologist in Miami who likewise is a nationally recognized specialist in breast cancer. He read the slide, same slide. His analysis was it is questionable. It could be cancer, but it could be just cellular dysplasia, which means disturbed cell, but it's not malignant. Then she still wasn't satisfied, so she sent it to a third specialist in California who was also a national expert. So now we're talking 3 national experts in breast cancer. He read the very same slide, and he said, absolutely not cancer, it's cell dysplasia. Okay, so now we've got 3 experts, one saying you have cancer, you've got to have a mastectomy, the second one saying, I don't know, and the third one saying, definitely not. Now, I know everyone thinks that it's cut and dried, it's no problem, but pathology is not as absolute as you might think it is. And so many cases it's a matter of opinion, it's not definitive, and so the doctors tend to go ahead and do something dramatic anyhow, because who's going to know anyhow? I had a friend, I think I've mentioned this before, who worked in a pathology lab in a hospital somewhere in Florida, and I ran into him and he says, I quit my job. He says, I couldn't take it anymore. He said, if a doctor diagnosed a lady with breast cancer, they brought her into the hospital, they did the mastectomy, they took a tissue sample, as they're supposed to, of the tumor, which they thought was a malignant tumor, and forwarded it over to the pathology lab to confirm. Now, confirm was really supposed to mean, was it really cancer or not? Well, he said there would always be a note attached saying your diagnosis is to confirm the doctor's diagnosis, which meant regardless of what it is, you say they had cancer. Now, this type of thing goes on a lot, and here, of course, it's become more known. And so I ran across another article called Overdiagnosis and Overtreatment in Cancer and Opportunity for Improvement, and so they're basically talking about the same thing. The word cancer often invokes the specter of an inexorably lethal process, and the people get scared, bottom line, and they're afraid they want to go do something. So that's another example of what I'm talking about. Why there's so many problems is that the medical establishment is in big trouble. It's become a massive business, and everything has to keep moving to make it work. When you open a huge cancer center, you need as many cancer patients as possible to run through that center. And if you find out maybe that there's other possibilities, then you may want to ignore those other possibilities. And it's certainly not going to get on the news, because guess who brings in the most revenue anymore to all the national media? It certainly is not the guys who are selling a bottle of vitamins or some herbs. It's more often than not major pharmaceuticals. So you know that they're not going to talk a lot negative about it. Now, I'm just going to bring up one more fast issue. I know our time is rapidly departing. We've already mentioned, I guess, 2 issues. I'm just going to mention the cholesterol thing again. Billions of dollars are being taken in every year, and many people are being damaged because the drugs prescribed are problematic. And I mentioned in another broadcast that the Cambridge International Institute for Medical Science put out a series of guides or booklets called Physician's Concise Guide to, and this particular one was called The Cholesterol Myth. Saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet are not the cause of coronary heart disease. The myth is the greatest scientific deception of the century, and perhaps any century. And that's a quote from George V. Mann, MD, professor of biochemistry and medicine, who was one of the original people in the involved with that study, the Framingham study, that's always cited, and I should say miscited. And so the drugs that are prescribed for that are liver damaging, and the other complications that go with it. And without going and over laboring the whole thing, just to say that that's another example of where all these adverse drug actions are coming from. The third one I'm going to mention again, I'm sure you're hearing more and more about it, and there's two strong schools, one absolutely for and one absolutely against. And this has to do with the vaccinations. As you've probably noticed, they're increasing the number and type, and I have to throw in an aside that many years ago, the pharmaceutical companies that manufacture vaccines encouraged government agencies to make it mandatory that everybody take these vaccines. And so to me there was a big plan, and that was step one. And so in many cases that became true, whether legally or just by plain intimidation, people were pushed into getting vaccinations. Then a few years after that, they went to the federal government and said, we want you to pass legislation making us harmless for any damage done by vaccines. Now, I thought that's strange for companies who are arguing that vaccinations are safe, that they would want a law making them, holding them harmless from damage. And so that's what happened. They were made harmless as far as being any responsibility for damage, and they set up a special court in Washington, D.C. to handle damaged cases. Now, I told you that the CDC already had said that probably only 10% of the adverse events are reported for several reasons. One is a doctor doesn't want to get himself in the middle of a big issue, so even if he thought it was the case, he would not report it, or even only if the people went otherwise and could prove it, that's the only time you could do anything with it. So anyhow, they set up this court in Washington. That's the only place you can go for a claim on a vaccination damage, and you have to prove it in this federal court, which is not a regular court because they don't have a jury. It's judge controlled, and he hears the evidence, he makes a decision, and the award is made, which has caps on it. But guess what? The drug company doesn't pay for that. The public pays for it because they put a surcharge on all the vaccinations that goes into a fund to pay for any damage. And so already that there's hundreds of millions of dollars have been paid out already, and there's actually now several thousand cases pending, but they've clamped down to make it more and more difficult to prove your case. The problem is that sometimes it's not today, but tomorrow or next week that the damage occurs from the event. Now, I've known a few cases where within minutes of an immunization, the child started screaming and never quit, and they suffered severe brain damage, had blinded, lost their hearing, and so forth. So I've seen that happen myself, and then I've seen some where they just went into a coma and didn't come out. But the thing is to prove that, and it's very difficult, unless they do it right on the table after they get the immunization. It's very difficult. But in spite of that, there have been some cases that still were able to prevail, but now they're making it more and more difficult because they've been trying to suppress evidence about it. And it's very complex, and I know it doesn't make any sense to you, but one of the big vaccines was the MMR, and of course there was a big controversy. They tried to destroy a doctor out of Great Britain because he suggested that there was enough evidence that it merited additional study. He didn't say it absolutely was the cause of autism, but he said that it's interesting that all of these cases that the child was doing fine, they received an MMR vaccination, and shortly after that they developed a terrible bowel disruption, and that's what he was a pediatric gastroenterologist. And actually people had come to him, patients of his and says, do you think there's any connection, because my child was doing fine till they had the vaccination, and then all of a sudden the bowel tract went crazy, and then after that they became autistic. And he said, well, I don't know, but he got a group of doctors together and they looked at a pile of cases, and it appeared that there's at least evidence suggestive. And so he and this group of doctors published a paper suggesting that there's a potential issue and that it merited further study. They submitted it to the Lancet, this big journal I was talking about, and the Lancet reviewed it with their peer review committee and said, well, yeah, the evidence is there that potentially it could be a problem and does merit further study, so we're going to approve the paper to be published. Immediately after the paper was published, this doctor's name was Dr. Wakefield, he was attacked by the British Medical Journal, one of the individuals in particular involved with it, and said that he was fraudulent, that he was doing it only for money, and blah, blah, blah. In other words, they misrepresented a pile of material. And if I recall, they actually retracted his license in Great Britain because of this journal article by this individual. And of course, Dr. Wakefield was not going to give up that easily. He hired investigators and found out that the person from the British Medical Journal had actually on the payroll of the company who makes the MMR vaccine. So I'm not saying that he was influenced by that, but it seems funny that he would make up a story to try to destroy someone who might in some way interfere with his relationship with this pharmaceutical. So anyhow, as time went on, other information came out, and finally, and I was looking that it came out that and here's the article says, controversial doctor and autism media channel director, proven right, MMR vaccine causes autism and inflammatory disease. That's the name of this article. But bottom line is, two landmark events, a government concession in the U.S. vaccine court and a groundbreaking scientific paper confirmed that physician, scientist, and autism media channel director Dr. Andrew Wakefield and parents were right all along. Now this is in 2012, and a recently published December 13, 2012 vaccine court ruling, hundreds of thousands of dollars were awarded to someone whose parents described how MMR vaccination causes severe debilitating injury to his brain diagnosed as autism spectrum disorder. Later the same month, the government suffered a second major defeat when young Emily Moyler from Houston won compensation following vaccine-related injury that once again involved MMR and resulted in autism. Now, in here, it says in which the government conceded or the court ruled that vaccines had caused brain injury. In turn, the injury led to an ASD diagnosis. MMR vaccine was the common denominator in those cases. Now, some others have showing up other places. I saw one in Italy, the same thing. But here's my point. After I read that, and they gave the actual court citations, which is public information, the court reporters report on cases, and so they gave the citation for it, so I decided I was going to get a copy of the case. And so I went to the United States court related to this, and guess what I got back? United States court, page not found. United States court, page not found. United States court, page not found. Mysteriously, they seem to have disappeared. Now, maybe you can find it. I haven't spent hours and hours trying to dig it up, but it's strange that all of a sudden it disappears. Okay. Now, in some of the court cases, here's something that happened I thought you might think interesting. The CDC caught hiding data showing mercury in vaccines linked to autism. In a press release issued this week, one that so far no mainstream media sources have bothered to report, it was announced that Dr. Brian Hooker had finally received documents from the CDC through a Freedom of Information Act that revealed the CDC had access to data linking thimerosal in vaccines to autism, non-organic sleep disorders, and speech disorders. 2 members of Congress helped Dr. Hooker draft the letter to the CDC after having spent nearly 10 years submitting over 100 Freedom of Information Acts to no avail. So far, this information has been completely blocked out of the mainstream media. The information is very damaging to the CDC, which has stated for years there's no studies linking the mercury of thimerosal in vaccines to autism. You can watch for yourself the video, and then they show a video about all this. So, I believe that's why this, but I think it's more than just the mercury personally. But the fact is they were trying to hide that. They knew it, and I also found out that Washington has a directive that all data related to mercury and autism, etc., be forwarded to the federal government. And I know in one case, this lady wanted to get access to those records, her attorney did, and guess what? The U.S. Attorney General got an order to seal those records so that this person could not have access to them. Now, just a couple of asides and then we're done. Looks like, as always, we've run over. And I'm saying all this to show you why modern medicine is in the state it's in. I mean, as I say, everything that I've given you, you can get on the internet and find for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But see, what's happened is, and I found this out a long time ago, all these so-called infectious diseases, and there's diagrams, have shown that they were declining and disappearing long before immunizations and the treatments that came out for them. And that you can find out for yourself. Just look for the decline of infectious diseases and you'll find out that all these ones that medicine has claimed victory for or benefit for actually were declining on their own before this happened. Now, I've been around long enough. I've watched all these things take place. I watched the polio mini epidemic that occurred back in the 40s and 50s, and I've watched the increase in immunizations and all the things that go with it. And I did note, however, that there's a book that's available that you might want to get a hold of called The Vaccine Epidemic, How Corporate Greed, Biased Science, and Coercive Government Threaten Our Human Rights, Our Health, and Our Children. And these people have done a big study on that, and you might want to purchase it. 2 authors, Louise Kuo, Habakis and Mary Hollard have done all the digging and have put together this book, and you might find it very interesting in your own pursuit as to what you want to do. I don't tell when people ask me, what do you think about vaccinations? My comment is, I personally wouldn't, and I wouldn't have my children or grandchildren vaccinated, but it's your choice. I think you should look into it, and you should read what you can find out about it, and then make your own decision based on that, because after all, you live with the consequences. So that has to be a decision that you make, but I sure would make it an informed decision. Now, why am I saying all this? It just seems like our country has gone crazy with medicine and with fear. They are kept in fear that if you don't have all these drugs available, you might die. And I'm not saying there's never some rare instance that might not be beneficial. I'm not saying that under no circumstances would you ever take a drug, but I can show you piles and piles of information about how it's abused, overdiagnosed, overtreated, and in many cases people are shot drugs without any real justification, hoping that the drug will appease the symptoms and the people will think that something good was done for them. And I think the biggest fallacy of all is to be taught that symptoms are the disease, because the symptoms aren't the disease. The symptoms are an expression of your body attempting to deal with something, and I think I would be more inclined to find out what is it that the body is attempting to deal with, rather than why do you want to turn off the switch. I've mentioned this before. but it's like having a fire alarm and it goes off and you cut the wire or turn off the fire alarm. You don't have to listen to the alarm anymore, but if there's a fire, at some point you're going to be in big trouble. And I had a patient that actually happened to, had a massive racetrack with, worth a fortune, $20 million actually. And the alarm went off, the fire alarm, and they went out to the zone it indicated. They couldn't find anything, went back and turned it off and reset it. Did again. After several times, they called the alarm company. They came out, did exactly the same thing, and finally said, well, for some reason there must be something faulty in the circuit, so they decided to disable the circuit. And in the middle of that night, she got a call, the lady did that owned the track, from the fire department saying the racetrack is on fire. She had a $20 million fire. And it was discovered that when the alarm system was put in, it was wired indicating the wrong zone, that there was a zone, that there was a fire starting, but it wasn't where it was indicating on the panel, and so she had this devastating fire. And it was 2 or 3 years of problems and litigation and everything before it finally was taken care of insurance-wise, and it actually went to court. So I'm saying is that turning off a symptom without knowing the cause of the symptom, even a headache, is not really a smart move. I know it's fast and easy just to write a painkiller prescription and send somebody out the door so the next patient can be seen, but to me, I have big questions about responsible medicine. It's true that if one time the person had a headache and you looked at what was going on in their life and what they'd been doing, and it looked like it was something that they had done, and you decided to relieve that headache, and then it didn't come back anymore because they didn't do that anymore, then you're probably okay. But if the person's continuing to have headaches and you keep giving headache medications or wherever pain is, to me that's a bit on the irresponsible side, and you need to look further. So I've given you enough to wrestle with, and hopefully to wake up and hopefully get out of this fear mode that everybody has to be on some kind of drug, and that's become so powerful that I've known of at least 2 elderly people who had never taken medication. That's rare today. One lady, this is some time back, was 85. She moved into this area. She had been doing natural health for her whole life and basically had rarely ever gone to a doctor and taken no drugs. And so when she filled out her health history, the nurse said, well, what drugs were you on? You don't show any. And the lady says, I don't take any drugs. And so the nurse said, oh, you don't understand. The doctor has to know what drugs you're taking in case he wants to prescribe something. She says, I don't take any drugs. The nurse left, brought the doctor back, went through the same procedure, and he said, I'm sorry, if you won't tell me what drugs you're taking, I will not take you as a patient. So he declined her, only because, and I've had some other people now tell me the same thing, a doctor today cannot believe that somebody could be 85 and be not on 5 to 10 medications. They just can't understand that. You must be on something. They can't understand health, I guess. They can only understand symptoms and managing symptoms. So you might want to inform yourself more, and I'm hoping what I gave you today is provocative enough that you might want to look into it for yourself. It was nice being with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and in the meantime, till the next broadcast, be healthy.